The story goes that Parsifal, a knight of the Round Table, went in search of the Holy Grail when he came to the land of the Fisher King, land that was wintered over and infertile. The king never moved from his bed, crippled by a wound received in his thigh. But he invited Parsifal to dine with him, and that evening Parsifal was entertained by a parade of musicians and maidens, and then the Holy Grail itself was brought before him before it was ushered out of the room. Parsifal slept that night, dreaming of the Grail and anxious for the morning when he would take it home to Arthur's court. But when he awoke, he found himself on the cold ground, with no castle or king or Grail in sight. He had failed in his quest. Why? He had failed to ask the Fisher King a question. So let's begin with a question of our own. What causes a question? A need, a desire to fill a curiosity. Questions stem from a sense that something is missing or doesn't add up, and we're drawn to make sense of what we don't understand. And so we begin a kind of quest, because all quests begin with a question.
And that's kind of what
Okay, and then so we really are 10.9A. So what are we really missing here? In 10.9A. We don't have W2A.
Nice.
Nice. Long way gone.
Let's look at
We don't have
poetry
any
book.
writing.
Okay, so
I mean, we can add that in.
we don't have them set out.
This happened in Ottawa, Canada. 36 eighth graders tossed beanbags every Saturday for 12 weeks. A pair of researchers from the University of Ottawa split the kids into two groups. The first tossed beanbags into a bucket 3 feet away every Saturday for 12 weeks. The second group tossed beanbags into two buckets, one set 2 feet away and another set 4 feet away. At the end of the 12 weeks, the groups were tested. They had to toss beanbags into a bucket 3 feet away, which is what the first group had been doing for 3 months and the other one hadn't. Guess which group did better? You probably figured it out. The second group. But why? Why would the group that never tossed beanbags at targets 3 feet away outdo those who had? Or consider this. The baseball coach at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo wanted to teach his players how to hit different pitches, a fastball, a curve, a slider, and so on. Like the researchers from Ottawa, he split his players into two groups. The first learned sequentially. They'd swing at fastballs over and over until they got good at it. Then they'd swing at curves over and over until they got better. Same thing for sliders and other pitches. The players showed immediate improvement. But the pitches for the second group were mixed. Hitters didn't know if they were getting a fastball, a curve, or a slider. The immediate results weren't as impressive. But over time, the second group got better than the first group, who plateaued and didn't improve. Confronted by differences, beanbag targets at 2 and 4 feet, pitches of varying speed, the brain solves the conflict by figuring out a concept that explains the difference. So beanbag throwers don't learn just how to hit a target, they learn how to judge distance. Hitters don't learn how to just hit a particular pitch. They learn the criteria that distinguishes one pitch from another. Put another way, they don't learn answers, they learn skills. They don't just gather information, they develop concepts.
so it's not worse, but it still might be.
This is the sound of a cat, and this is a cat, and this is a second cat. I want you to stop the film and on a sheet of paper describe what quality or characteristic these cats share. Go. Now this is a crab, and this is the sound of a crab. Again, I want you to stop the video and on a piece of paper describe what quality or characteristic the cats and crab share. Go. Now here's a question. What challenges did you encounter comparing the crab and cat versus just comparing cats? And last, here's a crystal, and this is the sound of crystal gale because I couldn't find a sound for a crystal. Stop the video again and describe what quality or characteristic the cats, crab, and crystal share. Most people find the progression increasingly difficult as they seek a connection. Statements about the cats are more concrete, but including crabs and crystals forces more abstract statements. The more varied the items, the more conceptual the statement that explains their connection.
Well, it kind of forces you to go back and look at the original object that you were looking at, so you have to reframe your perspective of the cat. It's no longer just the literal meaning, but now you're forced to make connections that you weren't forced to do before, so you have to kind of reevaluate, I guess, anymore, because now you have this other component that you're looking to tie to it. So you have to go beyond just the literal and move into that more abstract range to accommodate all three of these seemingly random objects.
Kind of what Patricia and Kelly said. I looked very literal at the two animals, tried to find commonalities, and then once we got to the crystal, kind of went beyond just literal description and what they kind of stand for or symbolize, and that's how I arrived at it.
Imagine a continuum of information. On the left we have ideas and sources that are similar, and on the right ideas and sources that are more varied or disparate. And this is important for our discussion, and again Dave kind of talked about this with the paper that I guess he and Nicole do with the kids. You can talk about the cats are stage 1, cats and crabs are stage 2, cats, crabs, and crystals are stage 3. In order to come up with something that encompasses all those different perspectives, you use that word, you have to get more abstract, more complicated in your thinking. History illustrates this idea. In the Renaissance, art was characterized by symmetrical and balanced arrangements, but as we approached the 20th century, it began reflecting more disparate and abstract ideas. In these works, order has not been replaced, but the old harmonies no longer suffice. Art becomes increasingly abstract to explain a more complicated world view. In the Ptolemaic vision, the universe is a series of perfect circles, enfolded in a heaven that did not change. But in the information explosion of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, a new type of scientist emerged, a field researcher, such as naturalist Alexander von Humboldt. Maps themselves are abstractions, but by Humboldt's time, exploration was altering the science of cartography. Humboldt pushed the abstractions of map-making even further, first creating theme maps with annotated physical images, and then finally abandoning pictures altogether, reducing data to charts and graphs. It's during the information explosion of the early 19th century that charts and graphs first appear, abstract compilations of information. By the 20th century, Ptolemy's perfect and timeless circles had given way to ellipses and an evolving universe. And we see this evolution in literature as well. When John Steinbeck wanted to capture the complexities of the Great Depression, he wrote The Grapes of Wrath from two perspectives, the story of the Jodes interwoven with more general chapters, suggesting that neither perspective could sufficiently explain what had happened to America. And after World War II, Traditional narratives struggle to explain the Holocaust or the nuclear age, and we find in the emergence of magical realism and theater of the absurd radical revisions, as in Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, where the author's true story of surviving the bombing of Dresden is enfolded in a science fiction tale of a character who time travels. More recently, David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas combines a half-dozen stories of differing styles and times, held together by a connection so abstract it resides not on Earth, but in the clouds. Humboldt's earthbound maps had given way to Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, suggesting that the more varied and diverse our information, the more nuanced and abstract our explanations. If I only give you information from similar sources, an opinion piece is not going to be terribly sophisticated. The nature of an opinion piece, if it's going to be effective, is going to have differing perspectives. I do the same thing with my kids when they have an opinion paper. They're not allowed to simply say, I'm for or against gun control. I've already made my mind up. Now I will go looking for the information that reinforces what I believe. That's stage one. You're just going to get that. Whatever your stance is, the requirement of the assignment is, okay, now go research the opposition. And not a straw man argument, but a very complicated, sophisticated argument. The more varied the perspectives are, to come up with a statement that's going to deal with that argument is going to have to be much more complicated and much more sophisticated for the students to make some sense of that. So how do we apply the stages of thought to our teaching? There are lots of ways, but here are 3 suggestions. And by the way, all the handouts in this section are available. Just check the credits at the end of this video. First, students need to know the kinds of questions that elicit varied data. For instance, questions of context, to zoom in, which is analysis, or to zoom out, which is synthesis. For instance, we can zoom in on The Great Gatsby to analyze it, and we can look at its place within the larger scope of Fitzgerald's work, or as another novel examining class relations in America. Some questions apply to characteristics, where we can compare or classify, contrast or differentiate, or transfer information. For instance, if we examine a range of characters in Shakespeare's plays, we might categorize them by similar qualities or differentiate the way they respond to a particular crisis. And when we transfer the qualities of one thing to another, we identify what makes it distinctive. Questions of sequence require that we understand the origins and causes of an idea or event. When we cherry-pick, we isolate an issue without regard for what surrounds it. It's important to know what caused the issue and what its ramifications are. And finally, when we theorize about a data, we begin to climb the ladder of abstraction. Having gathered our information, now we extrapolate or elaborate, inductively exploring what the data means. And here's another idea. Class discussions can be structured to encourage these kinds of questions. For instance, for discussion on modernism in my American Lit course, I give this list of topics to the class a week before the discussion. The topics are deliberately varied, ranging from songs like Brother Can You Spare a Dime and Strange Fruit, to phenomena like dance marathons, movie palaces, Shirley Temple, and the 1939 World's Fair. Students each take a different topic and do enough research to provide a 2-minute summary. When we hold the discussion, we try to identify the characteristics of modernism. Invariably, students bring up their research as the discussion twists and turns. Because the topics vary so widely, students have to think outside the box to make sense of the 2 decades between the world wars. And a third suggestion. As we noted with opinion papers, compare-contrast papers require writers to reconcile disparate ideas. My students did poorly on these until I clarified for them the stages of thought. For instance, let's say a student wants to compare Huck Finn and Holden Caulfield. Most students merely shifted between Huck and Holden. This is stage 1 thinking because students only looked at the characters and not an idea that unites them. We need an overall thought, a focus. For example, we might discuss the challenges of growing up as a young male in America. In other words, Huck and Holden are not the focus of the paper. They're the examples. The compare-contrast paper works only if we look for an abstract idea that reconciles the different subjects. So we don't merely identify characters, we explore their significance, moving from stage 1 simplicity to the more nuanced stage 2 and 3 thinking. It should be noted that with this kind of instruction, students need time to explore their thinking, and they will invariably feel challenged and befuddled. This is a good thing.
And so I feel like one of the things, speaking to what Jason is saying, we have to kind of mold our instruction to address that and to create a place for that. For them to know going into it, there are going to be moments where you're going to struggle and you're not going to know it, but we're going to get there and kind of deprogramming the need for a right answer, the need for a yes.
Instant
yes.
Well, what you're talking on, it's wonderful, is what we call dispositions, the attitude we take toward learning. And you're exactly right. I don't think our educational institutions build in that discomfort as part of it. Again, subtextually, I think we have taught that the brightest kids in the room are the ones that have an answer, as opposed to the ones that are processing and taking time. And going back to the pitching analogy. Thinking that's safe and familiar is comforting, but it's not really thinking. We learn best when we take risks. That's the lesson of Parsifal, who, cast out of the Fisher King's castle, wandered for years, encountering more challenges until he grew wiser. And after many journeys, he returned to the castle and asked the question that healed the Fisher King and restored the land. And what was the question? Well, look it up. You might learn something.